Hello everyone, today will be our first video in the History of Nations series. Today's video will be part 1 of the entire history of the United States of America. Enjoy the video. Starting around the late Paleolithic, about 10,000 to 30,000 years ago. Most of the United States was covered in ice sheets and glaciers, and its inhabitants traveled from Asia via the Bering Sea land bridge. Towards the Neolithic era, a period between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, the nomadic tribes of what is now America settled down. They developed new forms of shelter such as teepees and learned how to use valuable items like shells as currency. One tribe, the Na-Dene, are considered ancestors of the more recent Navajo and Apache tribes. They built large, multi-family houses which were probably similar to Native American longhouses, and they mostly hunted in summer and foraged in winter. This tradition and tranquility continued for a long time. By 1492, Christopher Columbus had set foot on the New World. Over the next 100 years, European explorers would start establishing settlements along what is now the east coast of the United States. One such example, Jamestown, was established in 1607 by the Virginia Company of London. The settlement was poorly planned and nearly failed if it were not for the Powhatan Confederacy, a group of Native American tribes living in modern-day Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. The Powhatan helped Jamestown grow and thrive. Meanwhile, the Dutch and France were starting to colonize in the north, while the Spanish colonized what is now Florida. The French and Dutch took advantage of the fur trade, as fur was very valuable. Dutch settlements were mostly in what is now the northeast of the U.S., this included the Hudson Valley and New Amsterdam, now New York City. The French set up settlements mostly in what is now western New York and the Ohio River Valley. Montreal was an important fortress and trading post for the French. By the end of the 17th century, most land west of the Mississippi River was controlled by one of these three powers. However, relations with Native American tribes were tense, especially for the British and French. However, one major power, the Dutch, would eventually cede their colonies to Britain in 1674 after the Third Anglo-Dutch War bankrupted the Dutch. As the mid-18th century approached, war seemed inevitable. By the early 1700s, the French had started building forts close to the British colonies. Tension was rising between the two superpowers, and war was officially declared in 1754. This was the French and Indian War. The war started with many successful French offensives against the British. Though the British easily outnumbered the French had the support of most Native American tribes and superior technology. However, not long after, the British learned from their mistakes and started winning more battles, and this eventually led to the major defeat at Montreal, a fur trading fortress. The French signed a treaty in 1763 promising to give the British all their land west of the Ohio River Valley. But, the British had some issues with the war. First, the war had bankrupted them and they were in a deficit. Second, the British had some ambition to expand even more. So, the British ended up taxing their American colonies and claiming more land north in Canada. However, many colonists living in Britain's 13 colonies along the east coast were unhappy about this. So, they boycotted British goods and products, instead relying on their own and ones smuggled from France and Holland. Eventually in 1773, at Boston, Massachusetts colony, rebellious colonists threw tea off of British merchant ships into the Boston harbor. In response, the British enacted even harder punishments on the colonies, and in April of 1775 war was declared. At the battles of Lexington and Concord, local militia squared off against armed British redcoats and grenadiers. Though the poorly trained Americans had no knowledge of warfare, they did know the terrain better than the British, which ultimately led to the British being driven back to Boston. Even though this was just a skirmish, this gave colonists morale, and on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. This important document officially declared the colonies independent. But, meanwhile, things weren't going as planned for the colonists. At the Battle of Long Island in 1776, the British defeated the army of General George Washington, who would later become the first president. The loosely organized American militia had lost over 2,000 men. However, instinctively, Washington would order his men to travel up north to White Plains and Hayes, a decision which probably saved his forces. However, the Battle of Saratoga would prove to be a turning point. Even though the British won a small victory at nearby Freeman Farm, the Americans' courage and sheer determination resulted in a major victory. The British had suffered over 1,000 casualties, while the Americans only suffered a mere 350. This also convinced France to join the war on the side of the American colonies. Many more battles would be fought, with outcomes mostly leaning towards the American-French coalition. But, the biggest victory came in 1781 during the Battle of Yorktown, when American and French troops laid siege to Yorktown, Virginia, a coastal port. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, eventually surrendered his forces to General Washington and the French forces. This prompted the British to negotiate with the Americans and French. And finally, after over 8 years of fighting, the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783 finally ended the war and the British accepted American independence. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 created the Constitution, a document which is the fundamental base for the country's laws. The Constitution was finally ratified by all 13 states in 1788. It became effective on March 4, 1789. Meanwhile, George Washington, Revolutionary War hero and general, was declared president in 1789 and he served 2 terms until 1797, when he served 2 terms. Washington's 2-term model would become a common practice with future U.S. presidents. Meanwhile, in the early 1800s, war was prevalent in Europe and Britain began a blockade using its Royal Navy along the East Coast, which ultimately led to the War of 1812. Meanwhile, slavery became a hot topic and in the North, abolitionists became intent on making slavery illegal while in the South, Southern slave owners needed slaves for their large plantations. The issue of slavery would become a disputed topic until the Civil War. Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd President of the United States, had agreed to the Louisiana Purchase with France in 1803, which gave America much more land west of the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, in the War of 1812, an American force attempted a failed invasion of British Canada. While the British land troops next to Washington, D.C. and they burned the White House down. But, eventually at the Battle of New Orleans, American forces led by General Andrew Jackson, also a future president, defeat nearly 8,000 British troops at New Orleans, modern-day Louisiana. The British suffer over 15 times the casualties of the Americans. That same year, the Treaty of Ghent ended the war and gave the U.S. control of West Florida from Spain. By this time, many Americans believed that their manifest destiny was to expand to the Pacific coast of the North American continent. Eventually, American settlers in Texas, a territory of Mexico, declared its independence in 1835 and put up an armed uprising against its Mexican government. Seeing the threat, the United States declared war in 1846 after annexing Texas. This would become known as the Mexican-American War. The war would last for over a year and a half with an American victory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave Texas, California and many other Mexican territories to the victorious Americans. Also at the same time, the California Gold Rush happened in 1848 when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. Nearly 300,000 people, mainly from the United States, but also from China and many other countries, immigrated to California in search of gold. Though most never actually found gold, the rush would help make California a U.S. state and speed up the United States reservation policy against Native Americans. The rush would end in 1855. However, tensions were rising as slavery became a hot topic again. After years of violence in Kansas, a new territory, Kansas outlawed slavery and became a Union state. This outraged many slave-owning Southerners, that go the opposite way. And when President Abraham Lincoln was elected, 11 Southern states succeeded and became the Confederacy. War broke out in April 1861, when the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter, a Federal fort and Union stronghold. After only 2 days, the 85 men of the Union garrison surrendered to the Confederates. This would be the Civil War. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. And at the Battle of Bull Run, Union troops engaged their Confederate counterparts, but a strong Confederate attack on the Union positions left Union troops in a retreat. Meanwhile, General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan took place. This plan was a naval blockade that would starve the South of crucial supplies and resources. Currently the general in charge of the Union Army was General George McClellan. General McClellan was known for his uncertainty and over-exaggeration of the enemy. His rival, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy, was a skilled general and planner. In 1862, McClellan landed in Virginia, aiming to take the Confederate capital, Richmond. The Union managed to defeat the Confederates at Malvern Hill. However, McClellan failed to pursue the outnumbered Confederate forces and the offensive was eventually called off. At the Battle of Antietam, later that same year, Union and Confederate troops threw themselves at the enemy, resulting in over 22,000 casualties and the bloodiest day in American history. Meanwhile in Tennessee, a relatively new General Ulysses S. Grant was gaining fame for his victory over Confederate troops at Shiloh, Tennessee. During the battle, over 40,000 Confederate troops advanced on the Union Army at Shiloh. The battle saw brutal fighting in the woods and over 23,000 casualties. Grant was criticized by many other Union generals for the over 13,000 Union casualties, but President Lincoln encouraged Grant to keep holding strong. Now Lincoln lost trust of General McClellan and appointed General Snapping Turtle McGee, also known as General Meade. At the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863, General Lee hoped to threaten Washington, D.C. by launching an invasion into Maryland. Lee thought that this might help the North negotiate a surrender with the South. The initial attack caught the Union off guard and the Confederates advanced through Maryland into Pennsylvania. However, eventually General Meade arrived and arranged the entire Army of the Potomac into a fishing hook position. This position relied on Union artillery and several hills to hold off the advancing Confederates. The Confederates launched several bloody attacks against the Union left flank, which almost fell. But Union forces held the position and managed to regroup, and when General Pickett of the Confederates launched an attack on the center of the Union positions, the Union held the position. The battle was over. Both sides had suffered over 50,000 casualties in just 3 days. The Confederates retreated, and now they could never threaten the North again due to a supply shortage. Meanwhile, at Vicksburg, Mississippi, a several-month-long Union siege led by General Grant finally succeeded in capturing the city. This meant that the Union had full control of the Mississippi River. Now, General Grant was in charge of the Union Army, and he and his best friend, General Sherman, steamrolled through the South, liberating slaves and burning down Southern infrastructure. However, they still suffered dearly, as in the miscalculated Battle of the Wilderness, the Union forces suffered nearly 18,000 casualties while the Confederates only suffered 11,000. However, by the time General Sherman had reached Atlanta, an important southern city, they had to besiege the city and waited 3 months to capture the southern city. This was an important victory, as now one of the biggest southern wartime industry cities was captured. Also at this time, Britain, France, and other European powers were looking less likely to intervene on the south side. With General Sherman in the south and General Grant in the north, the Confederates were poised to be defeated. When the Union captured Richmond, the Confederate capital, they found the city scorched and abandoned. Finally, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse and the Civil War had ended. Over 1 million people had died and the nation had suffered greatly. Next would come Reconstruction, although that will be explained in part 2. Hope everyone enjoyed this video. The 10 subscriber special will come very soon. And I hope everyone has a great day.